In October of 1957, a satellite the size of a beach ball crossed into orbit, and for the first time in human history, a machine built by people looked back down at Earth from space. 6 years later, in a Soviet greenhouse experiment nobody remembers today, scientists tried to figure out what crop could survive the trip beyond it. They didn't test wheat. They didn't test rice. They tested a lumpy, dirt-covered tuber that most of the civilized world had refused to eat just 2 centuries earlier. That crop was the potato. And to understand why scientists trying to conquer space would eventually bet everything on it, you have to go back roughly 8,000 years to a place with no rockets, no satellites, and no idea that any of this was coming. High in the Andes Mountains, in what is now southern Peru and Bolivia, wild potato plants clung to rocky, wind-scoured soil above 12,000 feet. These were nothing like the potatoes you'd recognize today. Small, some no bigger than a marble, bitter, and genuinely poisonous. Wild potatoes are loaded with glycoalkaloid compounds, solanine and tomatine, that cause vomiting, cramping, nausea, and in high enough doses, death. Eating one raw wasn't just unpleasant, it could kill you. And yet this was one of the only calorie-dense plants that could survive at that altitude, in that cold, in soil too thin and rocky for almost anything else. The people living there didn't have the luxury of walking away from it, so they didn't. The people living in these mountains figured out the danger the hard way, generation after generation, probably through sickness and death that left no written record at all. But they figured out something else too, something that would quietly shape the next 8 millennia of human agriculture. They discovered that soaking wild tubers in cold mountain streams for days leached out a portion of the toxins. Then, if you expose them to repeated cycles of freezing and thawing at high altitude, where nighttime temperatures regularly dropped below zero, you could break down what remained. It was slow. It required patience across days, sometimes weeks. It demanded an intimate understanding of chemistry these farmers never would have called chemistry. But it worked. And it didn't stop there. Generation after generation, farmers selected the least bitter tubers from each harvest and replanted them, discarding the ones that made people sick, keeping the ones that didn't. They didn't have a word for genetics. They didn't understand dominant and recessive traits, or heritability, or selective breeding in any formal sense. They were doing all of it anyway, purely through observation and patience, one growing season at a time, for thousands of years. By the time the Inca Empire rose to power across western South America in the 1400s, this patient, unglamorous work had produced something extraordinary. Inca farmers, cultivating the steep terraced fields carved into the mountains around Cusco and throughout the highland provinces, grew more than 3,000 distinct potato varieties. Some were bright yellow, some were deep purple, some were red, white, or blue, some so dark they looked almost black. They ranged from perfectly smooth and round to gnarled, twisted, and lumpy in ways that would unsettle a modern grocery shopper. Each variety was bred and selected for a specific altitude, a specific soil composition, a specific microclimate on a specific slope of mountain. The Inca hadn't just domesticated a crop. They had built an entire agricultural science around it, and through that science, they built a civilization. And they solved a problem that would stump European farmers for centuries afterward: storage. Fresh potatoes rot quickly, and in a world with no refrigeration, that's a serious limitation on any food system. But the Inca technique for making chuño was brilliant in its simplicity. Farmers spread freshly harvested potatoes across flat ground at high altitude and let them freeze solid overnight in the bitter Andean cold. The next morning, as the intense equatorial sun warmed the mountainside, families walked barefoot over the frozen tubers, squeezing the moisture out with their feet. They repeated this freeze and stomp cycle for several days until what remained was a light, chalky, bone-dry block that weighed almost nothing. Chuño could be stored for 5 years, 8 years, 10 years or more without spoiling. It was arguably the first processed food in human history, and it was a logistical miracle. It fed Inca armies on long military campaigns across the mountains. It sustained entire cities through lean harvest years. It was so central to daily life that the Inca partly measured time by how long it took to cook a pot of potatoes, and measured distance by how much chuño a traveler needed to carry between 2 points. This wasn't just a crop. It was the foundation of one of the largest empires in the pre-Columbian Americas. The people who would eventually introduce the potato to the rest of the world had absolutely no appreciation for any of this. When Spanish conquistadors arrived in South America in the 1530s, they were hunting gold and silver, and they found staggering quantities of both. What they barely noticed, and certainly didn't value, was the ugly little tuber that the people they were conquering ate at nearly every meal. Spanish soldiers and administrators did bring a handful of potatoes back to the Iberian Peninsula around 1570, but there were no celebrations, no royal proclamations. Potatoes were handed to sailors on long voyages as cheap provisions to fend off scurvy, and donated to hospitals and monasteries as food for the sick and the poor. The Spanish crown, busy counting Inca gold, had no interest in promoting a food that came from people they considered savages. That decision seemed small at the time. It was not. When the potato finally reached the rest of Europe in the late 1500s and early 1600s, the reaction ranged from suspicion to outright horror. You have to understand the context to see why. Europeans grew wheat, barley, oats, and rye, grains, noble crops, growing above ground in sunlight, reaching toward the heavens. Bread made from grain was considered a gift from God. Entire feudal economies were organized around grain cultivation. The potato, by contrast, grew underground, in the dirt, in the dark. It was lumpy, misshapen, covered in strange little growths people called eyes. Worse, it belonged to the same botanical family as deadly nightshade, one of the most poisonous plants in Europe. To many Europeans living in deeply religious, superstitious societies, this wasn't a botanical coincidence. It was a warning from God himself. The rumors spread faster than the crop itself ever could. In parts of France, the potato was formally blamed for causing leprosy, and the Parliament of Besançon banned potato cultivation outright in 1596 on those grounds. In Russia, the Orthodox Church called the potato the devil's apple and warned that eating it was a sin. In parts of Germany and Switzerland, people believed potatoes caused flatulence, uncontrollable desire, scrofula, and general moral corruption. Scottish Presbyterians refused to eat potatoes because the word potato appeared nowhere in the Bible, and therefore the crop could not possibly be intended by God for human consumption. That is not something anyone made up. It was a real theological argument made by real clergymen in real churches. For nearly 200 years after arriving in Europe, the potato sat in gardens mostly as a botanical curiosity. Wealthy people grew it as an ornamental plant, admiring its delicate purple and white flowers. Marie Antoinette reportedly wore potato blossoms in her hair at French court events. Botanical gardens in London, Seville, and Vienna displayed potato plants alongside other exotic New World specimens. Scholars wrote papers debating whether the tuber was edible, medicinal, or dangerous. But actually, eating the thing on a regular basis was beneath the dignity of any respectable European. Potatoes were animal feed at best and a mark of desperate poverty at worst. In England, even the poorest laborers considered it an insult to be offered potatoes instead of bread. Bread was civilized. Potatoes were not. That did not last. War changed it. Famine changed it. And a handful of stubborn, slightly eccentric leaders changed it. The first major turning point came in Prussia. Frederick the Great, who ruled from 1740 to 1786, had a very specific problem. His country kept getting dragged into devastating wars with neighboring powers, and during those wars, enemy armies would burn Prussian wheat fields to starve the population into submission. Grain was easy to destroy. You just set fire to it. But a crop growing completely hidden beneath the soil could survive an invading army marching directly over it, dinner sitting 6 inches below their boots the entire time. Frederick saw the military potential immediately. In 1756, he issued the Kartoffelbefehl, the potato order, commanding Prussian peasants to plant potatoes or face having their ears and noses cut off. The peasants were not enthusiastic. They considered potatoes disgusting, fit only for livestock. According to one widely repeated account, villagers in the town of Kolberg sent word to the king that potatoes had neither smell nor taste, and that not even dogs would eat them. Frederick was not amused, but he was clever. According to legend, he tried a different approach entirely. Instead of threatening his subjects further, he planted a royal potato garden on the outskirts of Berlin and stationed uniformed soldiers around the perimeter to guard it. The message was obvious without being spoken. If the king himself needed armed guards to protect these plants, they must be extraordinarily valuable. Prussian peasants began sneaking into the royal garden at night to steal seed potatoes for themselves, exactly what Frederick had intended all along. Whether every detail of the legend is historically accurate remains debated, but the result is beyond dispute. Within a single generation, the potato became a major staple crop across Prussia and much of northern Germany. Meanwhile, in France, a man named Antoine-Augustin Parmentier was fighting a similar battle with even more flair. Parmentier had been a pharmacist serving in the French army during the 7 Years' War, and after being captured by Prussian forces, he was held as a prisoner of war for 3 years. During his imprisonment, the primary food his captors gave him was potatoes. Day after day, meal after meal. He did not die. He did not contract leprosy. He did not lose his mind or his morals. He came out of captivity in surprisingly decent health. Better, in fact, than many soldiers who'd been eating the standard French military diet. That got him thinking hard about everything his country believed about the potato. After returning to France, Parmentier dedicated the next several decades of his life to a single mission: convincing the French people to eat potatoes, whatever it took. He hosted elaborate dinner parties for Parisian high society where every course, from appetizer to dessert, was made from potatoes. He presented potato blossoms to King Louis XVI, who reportedly tucked one into his buttonhole and wore it around the palace. He convinced Queen Marie Antoinette to wear them in her hair during court events, turning the potato flower into a fashion accessory. Then he pulled a version of the same stunt Frederick had used. He planted a large potato field in the sandy, infertile soil of the Sablons Plain outside Paris, posted armed guards during daylight hours to make the field look important, and conveniently pulled the guards away every night so curious Parisians would sneak in and steal the plants. Parmentier was essentially running a one-man public relations campaign for the potato decades before the concept of public relations even existed. And it worked. By the late 1700s, France had finally begun to accept the potato as human food. Today, France still honors him. The classic dish hachis parmentier, essentially a French shepherd's pie, bears his name. There's a Paris metro station named after him, a boulevard, a hospital. The man gave his life to a root vegetable, and France gave his name back to history. But while France and Prussia were slowly warming to the potato through clever marketing and royal endorsements, something very different, and far more dangerous, was happening across the English Channel, on the island of Ireland. And this is where the story of the potato takes its darkest turn. Ireland in the 1700s was under British rule, and the vast majority of Irish land was owned by English and Anglo-Irish Protestant landlords, many of whom lived in England and never once set foot on the estates they controlled. Irish Catholic peasants, the overwhelming majority of the population, were tenant farmers working tiny plots on land they did not own and could be evicted from at any time. British penal laws had systematically restricted what Irish Catholics could inherit, buy, or enter as a profession, and how much land they could rent. Families were pushed onto smaller and smaller plots of increasingly marginal, rocky, boggy soil. Many families survived on just 1 or 2 acres. The potato was almost perfectly suited to this brutal situation, as if it had been designed for it. 1 acre of potatoes could feed a family of 6 for an entire year. No other crop came close. The potato grew in poor soil where grain would fail. It thrived in the wet, cool Irish climate that made wheat and barley unreliable. It needed almost no equipment or investment. No plow, No horse, no mill. Just a spade, some seed potatoes, and rain, which Ireland never lacked. A family could survive on potatoes and buttermilk and almost nothing else, and the nutritional balance of that diet was actually reasonably complete. Carbohydrates, vitamin C, vitamin B6, potassium, even some protein, with buttermilk supplying calcium and fat. It was a diet that could sustain life indefinitely. And sustain it did. Ireland's population exploded from roughly 3 million people in 1700 to over 8 million by 1840. The potato made that astonishing growth possible. But there was a catastrophic flaw built into this dependency, and anyone who understood agriculture could see it coming. Nearly all of Ireland's potatoes came from a single variety, called the Irish lumper. Farmers did not grow multiple types, they grew one. That meant every potato field in every county in the entire country was genetically identical to every other. If a disease could kill one plant, it could kill every plant in Ireland simultaneously. There was no genetic diversity to fall back on, no resistant variety waiting in reserve, no plan B. The entire food supply of a nation rested on one genetic line of one crop, planted one way, harvested at one time. The clock was already ticking. Ireland just couldn't hear it yet. In the late summer of 1845, a cargo ship carrying potatoes from the Americas docked at a European port. Hidden within those potatoes were microscopic spores of an organism called Phytophthora infestans, a water mold that thrived in exactly the cool, wet conditions that defined the Irish climate. The blight spread across Belgium and the Netherlands first, then crossed to England, and then hit Ireland. The effect was almost instantaneous and absolutely devastating. Potato plants that looked perfectly healthy in the morning were black, wilted, and rotting by evening. Farmers walked into their fields and found entire acres of green, thriving plants collapsed overnight into stinking, blackened mush. When they dug up the tubers hoping to salvage something, they found the potatoes themselves had already turned to foul-smelling pulp beneath the soil. The stench of decay became so overwhelming in parts of Western Ireland, counties like Mayo, Galway, and Clare, that people tied rags over their faces just to breathe. The first year was devastating. What turned a bad harvest into an apocalypse was that the blight came back. It returned in 1846, worse than before, and again in 1847, and again in 1848. Year after year, the potatoes rotted in the ground. Families with no other source of food began dying in their homes, on roadsides, in the ditches beside the fields where their crops had failed. Typhus, cholera, and dysentery swept through the weakened, malnourished population. Entire villages in the west of Ireland were depopulated. Workhouses built to hold a few hundred people crammed in thousands, and mass graves filled behind them. Between 1845 and 1852, roughly 1 million Irish people died of starvation and the diseases that followed it. Another million emigrated, many on ships so overcrowded and disease-ridden they became known as coffin ships. Passengers died by the dozens during Atlantic crossings, their bodies thrown overboard. Ireland's population dropped by roughly 25% in less than a decade, and the country never fully recovered that number. Even today, nearly 180 years later, Ireland's population remains lower than it was before the famine struck. The British government's response made everything worse. While Irish families starved, Ireland continued exporting grain, butter, and livestock to England under armed military escort. Relief programs were slow, underfunded, and attached to degrading conditions. Starving men had to perform hard labor building roads that led nowhere in exchange for wages too small to buy the food that was rapidly becoming unaffordable. Charles Trevelyan, the senior British Treasury official overseeing famine relief, described the catastrophe as the judgment of God on a morally inferior people, and argued that providing too much aid would make the Irish dependent on charity. He wrote those words in official government correspondence, not in private. The famine was not simply a natural disaster. It was a natural disaster made catastrophically worse by political indifference and deliberate policy choices. The consequences rippled far beyond the island itself. The million Irish immigrants who fled the famine didn't simply disappear into the world. They reshaped it. Massive waves poured into Boston, New York, Philadelphia, and Baltimore, where they faced discrimination, poverty, and anti-Catholic hostility, but also built communities, labor movements, and political machines that would reshape American politics for the next century and a half. Irish immigrants settled in Liverpool, Glasgow, Melbourne, and Toronto, carrying a deep generational anger toward the British government that fueled Irish nationalist movements for decades and eventually contributed to Irish independence in 1922. The famine didn't just empty Ireland, it planted Irish communities, Irish culture, and Irish grievances across the English-speaking world, and the reverberations are still visible today. Here's the strange, unexpected part of this story. The famine did not destroy the potato's reputation. If anything, it proved beyond doubt just how indispensable the crop had become. The lesson the world took from Ireland wasn't that potatoes were too risky to grow. It was that you should never stake everything on a single genetic variety. Grow more types, breed for resistance, diversify. Plant breeders across Europe and the Americas began developing potato varieties resistant to Phytophthora infestans, and agricultural scientists established seed potato programs to ensure genetic diversity going forward. The disaster that nearly destroyed Ireland became the catalyst for a new era of scientific potato farming. Russia had actually been fighting its own potato battles long before the Irish famine. Catherine the Great tried promoting potato cultivation in the 1760s, ordering seeds distributed to provincial governors. Russian peasants resisted violently. In the 1840s, forced planting campaigns triggered what historians call the potato riots, where entire villages rose up against government officials trying to force the crop on them, burning fields and attacking the bureaucrats who planted them. Despite the resistance, the government eventually won out. By the 1850s and 60s, a combination of government pressure, agricultural reform, and simple hunger broke through the opposition. Within a few decades, Russian peasants were growing potatoes as a core staple alongside bread, and by the early 1900s, Russia had become one of the largest potato producers in the world. Rural communities gave it a revealing nickname, the second bread. In China, European traders and Christian missionaries had introduced the potato during the 17th century, but it remained a minor curiosity for a long time. That changed when farmers in the mountainous interior provinces of Yunnan, Sichuan, and Guizhou discovered potatoes could thrive at altitudes and in soils where rice paddies and wheat fields were impossible. By the mid-20th century, China had become the largest potato producer on Earth, and by the 21st century, the country was growing over 90 million metric tons per year, more than any other nation. India followed a parallel trajectory. British colonial officials introduced the potato to the subcontinent in the late 1700s, but it took decades to spread beyond small experimental plots. Once Indian farmers adopted it, production grew rapidly, and today, India is the second largest potato producer on the planet, feeding hundreds of millions across the subcontinent. The potato is now so embedded in Indian cuisine that many people forget it isn't native to the region at all. Across Africa, the potato arrived later, but spread with surprising speed. Countries in the East African highlands, Kenya, Ethiopia, Rwanda, Uganda, adopted potato cultivation during the 20th century and found the crop performed exceptionally well in their cool highland climates. The United Nations Food and Agriculture Organization has called the potato one of the most important tools for fighting hunger and malnutrition in the developing world, and multiple African nations have launched dedicated national potato programs to boost production and food security. Globally, the potato is now the fourth most important food crop on the planet, behind only wheat, rice, and corn. More than 300 million metric tons are produced every year across more than 150 countries. The sheer scale of what we do with potatoes today would stun an Inca farmer. French fries, which likely originated in Belgium or France in the late 1700s, are now a multi-billion-dollar global industry and arguably the most popular cooked food on Earth. Americans alone eat roughly 50 pounds of frozen potato products per person per year, most of it fries. The potato chip, which legend says was invented in 1853 by a frustrated chef in Saratoga Springs, New York, who sliced potatoes paper-thin to spite a difficult customer, has become its own enormous industry. The average American consumes about 30 pounds of fresh potatoes and another 17 pounds of potato chips every year. McDonald's alone uses more than 3 billion pounds of potatoes annually just for their fries, sourced from farms across Idaho, Washington, and Oregon. But potatoes are far more than food, and this next part tends to catch people off guard. Potato starch is used in manufacturing to make paper, textiles, adhesives, and biodegradable plastics. Vodka, one of the most consumed spirits on Earth, has been traditionally produced from potatoes in Poland, Scandinavia, and Russia for centuries. During the Second World War, German industrial chemists figured out how to convert potato starch into synthetic rubber for military vehicle tires when natural rubber supplies from Southeast Asia were cut off. Potato derivatives show up in pharmaceuticals, cosmetics, animal feed, and even the adhesive on the back of postage stamps. The potato isn't just feeding the world, it's holding parts of the industrial world together. And in 1995, the potato became the first vegetable ever grown in outer space. NASA and the University of Wisconsin successfully cultivated potato plants aboard the Space Shuttle Columbia as part of research into future long-duration space missions. If humanity ever establishes permanent colonies on the Moon or Mars, agricultural scientists believe the potato will almost certainly be among the very first crops planted. It grows in poor, mineral-heavy soil. It produces more calories per acre than any grain crop. It requires relatively little water compared to rice. It stores well in harsh conditions. It provides a broad range of essential nutrients, the same qualities that made the potato indispensable in the Andes 8,000 years ago. Make it the leading candidate for feeding human beings on another planet. Think about that for a second. A crop that the Spanish considered beneath their notice, that the French officially blamed for leprosy, that the Russians called the devil's fruit, and that Scottish clergymen refused to eat because it wasn't mentioned in the Bible, is now the leading candidate for the first food humans will grow on Mars. The potato started as a small, poisonous weed clinging to rocky slopes above the clouds in South America. Indigenous farmers spent millennia transforming it into something extraordinary. The Inca built an empire on top of it. The Spanish ignored it. Europe feared and despised it. A Prussian king and a French pharmacist dragged it into acceptance against enormous resistance. It fed the explosive growth of Ireland, and when it failed, it killed and displaced millions, reshaping the entire demographic map of the Atlantic world. It survived its worst catastrophe and went on to become one of the most important crops in human history, grown on every inhabited continent, and soon, possibly, beyond this planet entirely. Not bad for a lumpy root vegetable that nobody wanted.